Dr. Eric Dietz joins us now. He is the head of the Purdue University Homeland Security Institute. Dr. Dietz has collected data from various high-profile shootings such as Sandy Hook and has crunched the numbers and came up with some interesting statistics when it comes to an active shooter situation and how you can increase your chances of survival. Dr. Dietz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for asking me. Thanks.
No worries. Now tell me a little bit about these studies. What are some of the fascinating things that you guys have discovered over there at Purdue University?
Well, through a concept called Agent-Based Modeling, we've got a computer program that essentially allows us to mimic an active shooter event, and we can do it repeatably without harming anyone, without causing any concern for the public, basically in the computer environment. And in that environment, we can model police response time, shooter behaviors, and injuries to the public that might occur. And based upon that, we can come up with ideas with concepts of how we might modify our policies to reduce casualties during some of these events.
Okay. Mathematically, what are some of the things you said about a shooter shoots on average 30 people? Is that correct?
Well, the typical active shooter will engage about three targets, three individuals every minute. The typical police response time throughout the country is about 10 minutes. So some of these events that we've seen injuries in the order of about 30 individuals shot, some wounded, some killed, and we're able to reproduce that. What we're able to do, because we've got a computer modeling environment, is we can run that scenario with different shooter behaviors, different police response times, and different local preparedness measures in the building or structure or school. And we can compare the results. And we hope this is the way that we can actually improve our ability to design good policies, not policies that are affected by emotion, this is an issue that is so far been largely guided by emotion, either individuals who love guns or hate guns, and it's and they don't. There's not a common ground. So what we're trying to do is develop a better method for developing common ground and better communication back in what we're hoping to affect. Our research doesn't have insight into necessarily changing the gun laws, but what we want to do is change the outcome of these events to reduce casualties.
Piggybacking off of that right there, this isn't politics, this is science. So you say there are two effective ways to slow an active shooter. What are they?
Well, basically, we can affect them by limiting their access to the buildings, or reducing, improving barriers, locked doors, and so on. And the other is improving police response time or armed response time. So it could be police in our model, it could be armed security, or it could be concealed carry of individuals, that are within the building. And what we're able to do is we're able to compare those three methods basically to an unarmed or gun-free zone, and be able to offer better insights on what impacts might be seen if we have certain shooter behaviors. We're also able to modify the shooter behaviors, so we can have more aggressive shooters, we can have a little bit more methodical shooters, and be able to compare how our policies might react in either of those situations as well. So we can, again, just get better insight into how we might mitigate or how we might reduce the number of casualties, since, again, that's the ultimate goal is, we want to reduce the casualties and exposure from us with some of these kinds of events.
Okay. And in a situation like Paris, for instance, or Orlando, you're in a crowded concert hall or a nightclub, and these are places where guns aren't permitted. You can't bring in a gun. But you say the barrier is the point, creating some sort of obstacle for the shooter. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The obstacles, again, could be a locked door or a lockable door, a locked vestibule, for instance. We have that on many of our schools. We have double sets of locked doors coming into many of our schools. You buzz in the first door, you have a speaker, you offer what your business is, and based upon you announcing yourself and your business, you get in the second door. That seems to be a fairly effective way of managing access. The other might be at the nightclub is armed security. And what we've seen, especially in Orlando, is perhaps one armed security is insufficient. We need to look at how predictable the security measures are and also how robust they are. For a well-armed, determined gunman like we saw in Orlando, one security person was not as effective as any of us would have hoped. Clearly, that outcome was not what the public, the event venue, or any of the patrons would have hoped in that case.
And what about a situation like a San Bernardino where the shooter's already inside the building? He's a friendly face or a friendly person. What about a situation like that?
Well, and that's the case where we see, that kind of known person. That happens in many of our schools with some of the school shootings that we've seen. Is you're really faced with trying to have armed security that can respond much more quickly and reduce the impact with another armed individual. I mean, basically, it's been offered many times, but the best defense against an armed intruder is a good guy or a good person, with a gun to counter the armed intruder. The data suggests the active shooter data since year 2000 that the FBI recently published suggests that as soon as these active shooter individuals are confronted, they cease their activity. They either cease because they're engaged by the police or the friendly shooter. They surrender or they kill themselves. So the best defense with these things is reducing the response time and improving the engagement methods to try to confront them as early and as quickly as possible.
You've also come up with a way to help businesses or churches analyze their particular threat risk. Tell me about that, and what heightens the risk at an individual place?
Basically, the heightened risk is it seems, and as suggested by our data, is the gun-free zones, the elimination of firearms improves the risk. And that's simply because you've now relying on solely police response time as the means of countering an armed gunman. Again, that's a 10-minute response time. Our model with the schools, what we did is we had a handful of armed teachers. We've tested different carry conditions, whether the guns were in safes or locked or loaded or not loaded, for instance. And we're able to show even a handful of teachers, appropriate teachers that feel comfortable doing this, that are well armed and shelter in place with their children. Basically, that means they don't act as surrogates for law enforcement. They just tell the children to stand behind me, I'll protect you if the gunman comes in the room. And by running our model thousands of times, we can come up with an averaging of kind of the impact of what happens if we have a handful of teachers with guns and a handful of locations that are more dangerous to shooters, and only looking at the consequence that the events happen, not looking at the likelihood that the armed teachers or the news of not a gun-free zone, but an armed protective zone that this would be. Just the teacher alone can reduce the casualties by 5 to 15%, depending on the level of concealed carry and the carry condition that the teachers are permitted. So while that's not big, that gives us an indication that we're on the right path for trying to reduce the casualties. The single greatest thing that reduced casualties in a school or a business setting was the presence of an armed security officer, an armed individual, security contractor, or an off-duty police officer who's armed and ready to respond just like an officer. Clearly, that drastically reduces the response time and drastically reduces the casualties. Again, our data showed for schools that could be over 70%.
You talked about concert halls and clubs and things of that nature, but what about the opposite when you're caught in an open area, such as a Times Square or Paris, and something like this happens?
Yeah, that's where we really think our model can be adapted to start to test this run, hide, fight methodology. So the idea, if you can get out of harm's way, do it. So the simple answer is if there's a gunman, turn the other way and run, move, walk, whatever you can, crawl as fast as you can, getting away from the gunman. That's the best answer. Always to get away from the scene of the incident. The faster you move, the longer that you move, the harder a target you're going to be to hit, and the further away you are, making you basically a more elusive target. Sheltering in place or hiding is not a particularly great thing unless you've got locked doors or something else. So these open venues, basically, you're left with getting out of the way or confronting the gunman, trying to not become a casualty yourself, and then confront them when they're reloading. That's not a particularly, um, you know, great option. And that basically says, I would take from that as a researcher that those open venues need to have much more a heightened sense of security, armed police, armed security individuals that can counter these kinds of events, or they need to have a perimeter that they eliminate the weapons from the crowds, or eliminate individuals from having easy, ready access into the crowds. Security, like we see at the political conventions recently, that was basically almost like similar security what we see at the airports, magnetometers, full checks for individuals before they get into the venues. That may be one of the things that we really need to see at some of these large events. So we're looking at these large events now, trying to better understand what kind of resources we need. The same modeling tools that we've used and described to reduce casualties can be used to determine how many security individuals do we need to maintain a low line. So for instance, if we want to maintain a 15-minute wait in line and we think we're going to have guests that show up at these events with a certain arrival pattern, we can better determine what kind of staff is needed at these events. We can also better determine what kind of staff is needed based upon what kind of security checks are in place, hand wands, full magnetometers, and that kind of thing as well. So these same modeling tools, and we're working on that. We've worked on that with event venues like a couple of major motor races that happen in Indiana on an annual basis. We honed some of these skills with the races. We've also done that with professional sports, and we've also tested our methodology for this even overseas in England with sports venues there. Essentially, what we've found is we've got a method of measuring the security delivery, and we believe if you can measure the security delivery process, you can start to treat the security like an engineering problem. You can try to optimize it, you can reduce the costs, you can manage the costs, you can reduce the wait times, and determine what kind of staffing and arrangements you need for that. We also believe that we can introduce performance-based contracts into the security contractors that are predominantly what we see with running some of these special events. And the security contractors sometimes have excellent training in individuals, and sometimes they don't. And that's where we think if we can measure that, we can encourage the contractors to improve performance, again, for the benefit of the public. We've seen this in many cases where we have security that then the lines back up, and then the soft target becomes in front of security. We see this at the airports and a number of other venues. So again, we think part of the problem here is trying to make sure that we reduce the soft targets, reduce that soft target profile. So having the right level of security to deliver the right security services, so then individuals can more rapidly get into this, what we deem and hope to manage and control as safe areas, is very important.
That is very useful information, Dr. Dietz. It's great work you guys are doing over there at Purdue.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.